The old trucker, Jake, had seen a lot in his time on the road. He'd weathered the fury of blizzards, the scorching heat of deserts, and the loneliness of endless highways. But nothing, not even the time he'd been held at gunpoint by a desperate hitchhiker, had prepared him for the night on Route 66. It was a cold, windswept night, and Jake was hauling a load of antique furniture from Chicago to Los Angeles. The interstate was nearly deserted, save for the occasional distant headlight. As he passed a particularly desolate stretch, he felt a strange chill, as if someone had walked over his grave. He shook it off, attributing it to the cold, but the feeling lingered. Then he saw it. A lone figure stood on the side of the road, waving frantically. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered nightgown, her face pale and drawn. Jake hesitated. He'd been warned about hitchhikers, but something about this woman tugged at his heartstrings. He pulled over. As he approached the woman, he noticed a peculiar detail. There was no car in sight, no sign of any other vehicle on the road for miles. The woman looked at him with wide, frightened eyes, and her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "Please, help me. They're coming for me." Jake didn't have time to ask questions. He ushered the woman into his cab, and as soon as she was inside, he floored it. He could feel her trembling beside him. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the truck. "The spirits," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're trapped here, on this road. They want me to join them." Jake tried to dismiss her words as the ravings of a frightened woman, but the more she spoke, the more convinced he became that she was telling the truth. She told him about the accidents that had occurred on this stretch of road, about the ghosts of the victims who still haunted the place. She said they were drawn to her because she was weak, because she was alone. As Jake listened, he felt a growing sense of dread. He looked out the window, and it seemed to him that the darkness was closing in, that the very road itself was alive with a sinister energy. He glanced at the woman, and her face was filled with terror. Then he heard it, a faint, mournful wail, like the cry of a lost soul. It grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be coming from all around them. Jake pressed his foot down harder on the accelerator, but the truck seemed to be struggling. It was as if something was pulling at it, holding it back. The woman screamed, her voice filled with a primal fear. Jake looked at her, and his blood ran cold. Her eyes were no longer human. They were black, empty, and filled with a malevolent intelligence. Before he could react, the woman lunged at him, her claws outstretched. Jake managed to dodge her, but she was on him again in an instant. They grappled for control of the steering wheel, and the truck swerved wildly, careening off the road and into a ditch. Jake was knocked unconscious, and when he came to, he found himself lying on the ground, surrounded by shattered glass and twisted metal. The woman was nowhere to be seen. He climbed out of the wreckage and looked around, but there was no sign of her. 6. The experience had left him shaken to his core, haunted by nightmares and a pervasive sense of unease. He tried to put it behind him, to focus on his work and move on with his life, but the memory of the woman and the terrifying events that followed continued to plague him. Months passed, and Jake thought he was beginning to regain his peace of mind. He had taken a new route, avoiding the stretch of highway where the encounter had occurred. But then, one evening, as he was driving through a remote part of Arizona, he felt a familiar chill. It was the same sensation he had experienced that night on Route 66. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling persisted. As he drove, he noticed a strange, almost ethereal glow emanating from a deserted farmhouse on the side of the road. Curiosity overcame his fear, and he pulled over. The farmhouse was old and dilapidated, its windows boarded up and its paint peeling. As Jake approached, he felt a sense of dread wash over him. He hesitated for a moment, then summoned his courage and stepped onto the porch. The door was unlocked, and it creaked open with a groan. Inside, the house was dark and dusty, filled with a thick, oppressive silence. Jake fumbled for his flashlight and switched it on, illuminating the dim interior. As he explored the house, he found himself drawn to a particular room. It was a small, cluttered bedroom, filled with strange, antique objects. In the center of the room, on a dusty pedestal, stood a small, ornate box. As Jake approached the box, he felt a strange, tingling sensation in his fingertips. He reached out to touch it, and as his fingers made contact, the box began to glow. A faint, otherworldly music filled the room, and the air seemed to shimmer with an eerie light. Then he saw her, the woman from Route 66, standing in the doorway, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of hatred. She raised her hand, and a blast of cold, icy wind swept through the room, knocking Jake to the ground. As he struggled to get up, he saw the woman approach the box. She reached out and touched it, and the glow intensified. A chilling scream echoed through the house, followed by a deafening crash. When the dust settled, Jake found himself standing alone in the ruined farmhouse. The box was gone, and the woman was nowhere to be seen. He stumbled outside, into the cold night air. As he looked back at the farmhouse, he saw a faint, ethereal light flickering in one of the windows. He knew that whatever had happened inside, it was not over. Jake's encounter with the woman and the mysterious box had left him deeply disturbed. He returned to his truck, his mind racing with questions. What was the significance of the box? What had happened to the woman? And most importantly, was he truly safe? As he drove away from the farmhouse, he felt a sense of unease that wouldn't leave him. He knew that whatever had happened there, it was connected to the woman he had met on Route 66, and he was determined to find out the truth. Days turned into weeks, and Jake's obsession with the mystery grew. He spent countless hours researching the history of the farmhouse, poring over old maps and newspaper articles. He even contacted a local historian, a man named Elias, who had a reputation for knowing the dark secrets of the region. Elias listened to Jake's story with a mixture of interest and skepticism. He told Jake about a legend that had been passed down through generations, a tale of a powerful artifact known as the Heart of Darkness. According to the legend, the Heart of Darkness was a relic of great power, capable of manipulating the minds of men and controlling the very forces of nature. It's said that the Heart of Darkness was hidden in a secret chamber beneath an old farmhouse in the desert, Elias explained. The legend also speaks of a guardian, a woman who was tasked with protecting the artifact from evil forces. Jake's heart pounded with excitement. He had found a connection between the woman he had met and the legend of the Heart of Darkness, but he still didn't understand why the woman had seemed so desperate to possess the artifact. Driven by a newfound determination, Jake returned to the farmhouse. He knew it was a dangerous gamble, but he couldn't resist the pull of the mystery. This time, however, he was prepared. He had brought with him a small team of experts, including a historian, a paranormal investigator, and a geologist. Together, they explored the farmhouse, searching for any clues that might lead them to the secret chamber. After hours of searching, they discovered a hidden passageway behind a loose stone in the basement. The passageway led to a small, underground chamber. In the center of the chamber, on a stone pedestal, sat a small, ornate box. It was the Heart of Darkness. As Jake approached the box, he felt a surge of power. The air around him seemed to crackle with electricity, and the very walls of the chamber seemed to vibrate. He reached out to touch the box, but before he could, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the woman from Route 66, her eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. She lunged at Jake, her claws outstretched. A fierce battle ensued, the chamber echoing with the sounds of their struggle. In the end, Jake managed to subdue the woman. She collapsed to the ground, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hatred. As he stood over her, he felt a strange sense of pity. She was a victim of the artifact, a pawn, in a game she didn't understand. With a heavy heart, Jake took the Heart of Darkness. He knew that it was a dangerous artifact, capable of great evil, but he also knew that it was his responsibility to protect it, to ensure that it never fell into the wrong hands. As he left the farmhouse, he looked back at the place where he had faced his greatest fear. He knew that he would never forget the night on Route 66, the night that had changed his life forever, and he was determined to use the power of the Heart of Darkness for good, to protect the world from the darkness that lurked within. The Haunting of Highway 7. Highway 7, a stretch of road that winds through the heart of the Amazon rainforest, is infamous for its disappearances. Stories abound of vehicles vanishing without a trace, their occupants never to be seen again. One such tale is the chilling account of the truck driver, Elias. Elias was a seasoned trucker, known for his fearless spirit and love for the open road. One evening, he found himself driving along Highway 7, the dense jungle looming on either side. The sky was dark, the only light coming from the truck's headlights, casting eerie shadows into the undergrowth. As Elias drove, a sense of unease crept over him. The road ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly, devoid of any signs of civilization. He checked his map, but it was of little help in the dense jungle. The GPS signal had long since faded. Suddenly, a strange noise echoed through the night. It was a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of snapping branches. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. He slowed the truck, straining to hear the noise. Then he saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, larger than any he had ever seen, peering out from the darkness. Fear gripped Elias as he tried to accelerate, but the truck seemed to be stuck. The engine sputtered and died. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped in the heart of the jungle, surrounded by whatever creature had made that terrifying sound. As he sat in the darkness, listening to the eerie sounds of the jungle, Elias felt a sense of dread that he had never experienced before. He knew he was in grave danger, and that he might never see the light of day again. The darkness seemed to swallow Elias whole, its oppressive weight bearing down on him. He tried to keep his eyes open, to remain alert, but the fear was overwhelming. He could hear the creature moving closer, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. A cold sweat broke out on Elias's forehead as he fumbled for his phone. He tried to call for help, but there was no signal. Desperation gnawed at him as he realized he was completely alone, at the mercy of whatever lurked in the darkness. The creature's eyes, two glowing orbs that seemed to pierce the darkness, appeared at the window. Elias let out a scream that echoed through the jungle. The creature lunged at the truck, its claws raking across the metal. The truck shuddered but held firm. Elias scrambled to the passenger side, hoping to escape through the window. But as he reached for the handle, the creature's powerful jaws clamped onto the truck door. The metal groaned under the strain. With a final, desperate effort, Elias managed to force the window open. He leaped out of the truck and ran into the darkness, the creature's howls echoing behind him. He stumbled through the undergrowth, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the creature's presence closing in on him. As he ran, Elias stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a towering, ancient tree. Desperate, he ran towards it, hoping to find refuge. As he reached the tree, he saw a small wooden hut nestled at its base. Without hesitation, Elias burst into the hut. He slammed the door behind him, locking it with a trembling hand. The hut was small and dimly lit, but it offered a momentary respite from the terror outside. Elias leaned against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He closed his eyes, trying to calm his racing heart. He could hear the creature pacing outside, its claws scratching at the door. The sound was like a death knell, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the threshold. As the hours passed, Elias's fear began to give way to a sense of resignation. He knew he was trapped, and that there was little chance of escape. He tried to think of his family, to remember the happy times they had shared, but the images of his wife and children only made his loneliness more acute. Just as Elias was beginning to despair, he heard a faint sound coming from outside. It was the sound of a vehicle approaching. Hope flared within him as he rushed to the window. He saw a small Jeep driving down the path towards the hut. The Jeep stopped, and a figure emerged from the driver's seat. It was a man wearing a uniform that Elias recognized as belonging to the local park rangers. The man approached the hut and knocked on the door. Elias opened the door, relief washing over him. The ranger introduced himself and asked Elias what had happened. Elias explained his ordeal, his voice trembling with emotion. The ranger nodded sympathetically. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "These creatures are dangerous. They're a rare species, and they don't take kindly to intruders." The ranger helped Elias into the Jeep and drove him back to civilization. As they drove, Elias looked back at the ancient tree and the hut where he had faced his greatest fear. He knew he would never forget that night, but he was also grateful to be alive. He had learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of the wilderness, and he vowed to never venture into the jungle alone. Drove Elias back to the nearest town, where he was able to contact his family and let them know he was safe. As he waited for his loved ones to arrive, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that he had been touched by something truly evil. The memory of the creature's glowing eyes and the terrifying sounds it had made haunted him. When his family arrived, they embraced him tightly, tears of relief streaming down their faces. Elias was grateful to be reunited with them, but he knew that his life would never be the same. The experience had changed him in profound ways, and he would carry the scars of that night with him forever. In the days and weeks that followed, Elias struggled to come to terms with what had happened. He tried to talk about it with his friends and family, but they were unable to comprehend the horror he had faced. He felt isolated and alone, as if he were the only person who truly understood the darkness that lurked in the jungle. One day, Elias decided to return to the site of the incident. He wanted to see the tree and the hut where he had faced his greatest fear. As he drove down the winding road, his heart pounded in his chest. He remembered the terror he had felt that night, the fear that had nearly consumed him. When he arrived at the clearing, he was surprised to find that the hut had been destroyed. The walls were collapsed, and the roof had caved in. The ancient tree, however, still stood tall and proud. Elias approached the tree and placed a hand on its rough bark. He closed his eyes and thought about the creature that had attacked him. As he stood there, a sense of peace washed over him. He realized that he had survived the ordeal, and that he was stronger for it. He had faced his greatest fear and emerged victorious. The creature that had haunted him was no longer a threat. It was a memory, a dark chapter in his life that he could now put behind him. As Elias turned to leave, he noticed something strange. In the undergrowth, he saw a small, glowing object. He knelt down and picked it up. It was a small, spherical object, about the size of a marble. It was smooth and cool to the touch, and it seemed to pulse with an eerie light. Elias stared at the object, his mind racing. He didn't know what it was, but he felt a connection to it. He placed it in his pocket and turned to leave. As he walked away, he looked back at the clearing one last time. He knew that he would never forget what had happened there, but he also knew the old Peterbilt groaned and shuddered as I coaxed her down the deserted highway. The headlights sliced through the thick, fog-laden air, casting eerie shadows that danced and flickered on the pavement. It was a long haul, a solitary journey that I'd made countless times before. But tonight, there was something different. A sense of unease had settled over me, a premonition of something sinister lurking in the darkness. I checked the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. A pair of glowing eyes seemed to be watching me from the roadside. I blinked, but they were still there, fixed on me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I slammed on the brakes, my tires skidding on the wet road. When I looked again, the eyes were gone, swallowed up by the fog. Shaking my head, I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was almost midnight, the perfect time for something truly terrifying to happen. As I drove on, the fog grew thicker, enveloping me in a shroud of white. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I switched on the hazard lights, hoping that another driver might see me, but there was no sign of life on the road. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from beneath the truck. I pulled over to investigate, my heart pounding in my ears. The noise grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed a flashlight and crawled under the truck. To my horror, I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring up at me from the darkness. A large, shadowy creature was wedged beneath the truck, its claws digging into the metal. It let out a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. I scrambled back, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. I ran to the cab and jumped inside, slamming the door behind me. The creature let out a furious screech, its claws raking against the metal. I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine wouldn't start. Panic surged through me. I was trapped. The creature was still out there, clawing at the truck, its eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. I fumbled with the door handle, trying to force it open, but it was jammed. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard a noise outside. It sounded like someone was banging on the window. I peered out, my heart pounding. There, standing in the fog, was a figure dressed in a long, flowing coat. The figure held a lantern, its light casting eerie shadows on the creature's face. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream and retreated into the darkness. The figure approached the truck, their face obscured by the fog. They rapped on the window again, and I rolled it down. "Are you all right?" the figure asked, their voice deep and resonant. I nodded, my voice trembling. "Thank you," I managed to say. The figure smiled. "You're welcome. I saw you from a distance. I knew you needed help." I looked at the creature's retreating form. "What is that thing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure shook their head. "It's best not to know. Just be glad you're safe." With that, the figure turned and disappeared into the fog. I watched them go, a sense of awe and gratitude filling me. I had escaped death by a hair's breadth, and I would never forget the night I encountered the creature of the fog. Encounter with the creature of the fog had left me shaken to my core. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something sinister lurking in the shadows. I tried to convince myself it was just a product of my overactive imagination, but the fear remained. I decided to take a break from driving and spend some time with my family. The peace and quiet of my hometown was a welcome change from the endless stretches of highway. But even here, I couldn't escape the feeling of unease. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a noise outside. It sounded like someone was scratching at the window. I sat up, my heart pounding. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. There, standing in the moonlight, was the creature of the fog. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, and its claws raked against the glass. I froze, terror coursing through my veins. I knew I couldn't fight it, couldn't outrun it. I was trapped. Just as the creature was about to break through the window, I heard a voice. It was the same voice I had heard the night of the encounter. "Don't be afraid," the voice said. "I'm here to help." A figure stepped out from behind the creature. It was the same person, dressed in the long, flowing coat. They raised their hand, and the creature let out a blood-curdling scream. It retreated into the darkness, its eyes filled with fear. The figure approached the window, their face illuminated by the moonlight. "It's over now," they said. "You're safe." I nodded, my voice trembling. "Thank you," I whispered. The figure smiled. "You're welcome. But remember, there are things in this world that we don't understand. Sometimes, it's best to leave them alone." With that, the figure turned and disappeared into the night. I watched them go, a sense of peace washing over me. The creature of the fog was gone, and so